Hello everyone, it's September 7th, 2021. So this week it's Firefly's turn to attempt orbit, but not quite make it. They were done in by Reaver, wouldn't you know it? It was a valiant effort, and I'm sure they'll make it off this rock soon enough. But for now, let's get into what happened and liftoff. And we've cleared the tower. Welcome to episode 324 of the Orbital Mechanics Podcast. I'm David.
I'm Ben.
And I'm Dennis.
So at the top of the show, let's talk about Virgin Galactic, and then we won't mention them again after that. Not that we're trying to not mention them, but...
yeah, it really sounded like you were,
yeah.
like you were promising that we weren't going to do it again. The question is, what happened? So we know that that the most recent flight with Branson on board went off its plane trajectory. It actually entered Class A airspace, which, you can't do that without authorization. You can't do that. But it's funny because there's been this whole back and forth, where Virgin Galactic is like, nothing went wrong. Like the wind speed was wrong, and our pilots responded appropriately and reported the wind speed change and did everything they could. Then other people are like, well, actually, no, you didn't do anything to to address the winds. And by the way, the winds were not out of norm. They had normal winds up at altitude. So yeah, so leaving your protected airspace without authorization and apparently without cause, that's going to be a setback.
There were some concerns raised by a former pilot, right? The one who had flown on previous flights, which was Mark Stuckey, or Mark Forger Stuckey. And he raised some concerns, and then apparently promptly after that, he was let go from Virgin Galactic.
And who are you going to believe? The PR department or the what did he do? He was the flight test director. Everybody can lie or misunderstand or mislead. There's no guarantees until we have actual data. But yeah.
If you want to follow your priors, you probably want to assume that it's the company that's being a bit off.
Right. The spin department is the one that's spinning, and the person who's willing to risk his job is, I don't know. If you have a grievance that does degrade your credibility, but I don't think there's any indication that he did. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the situation to speculate too much.
But we do know, at least, though, that the spin department really did spin their statement after the FAA grounded Spaceship Two. They kind of just emphasized, oh, no one got hurt. It was unfortunate and serious that, our trajectory deviated a little bit from the permitted altitude, but, we did a good job of, rectifying it, and there's just no issue. And then Ben Hallert, friend of the show, tweets right back at them immediately, basically pointing out that they didn't mention any of that Class A airspace violation at all, which is, like you say, is a big no-no for good reason.
So, FAA is calling it a mishap, and they're doing an investigation. So we will know with high certainty what we know, I guess. There's no guarantee that the investigation will explain everything, but it'll at least give us confidence in the data that we do have. So looking forward to that.
I'm going to anticipate a short and sweet.
Yeah,
at least.
Most likely.
Yeah.
Depends on how long the mishap report is.
Yeah, unless it gets really salacious.
Yes, let's talk about Firefly Alpha, which had a launch failure, but I don't think there's any controversy surrounding that. I mean, there are some questions, but yeah, so Firefly Alpha, I guess we can call this episode Per Latum Ad Astra Part 2. It's very much the same kind of a feel to me. We had this, new company trying to get
Deja
to space.
vu.
Yeah, things went sideways, literally again, although a little bit higher up. And I think also, unsurprisingly, due to most likely an engine failure, I think almost certainly really, but yeah, I guess we can talk about that. So what are your thoughts? And did you watch it live? Because I didn't, I forgot, but I saw a tweet or something, and then I, immediately took a look at it.
I caught it semi-live, where I was just immediately after the fact, and I was catching the reactions on social media live.
Yeah, no, I wasn't watching. So I think we kind of need to start out by talking about Alpha. It has 4 Reaver engines. So you can check these photos out in the show notes, but I've got two photos that I think tell a big story. One is the 4 Reavers on a test stand, and then the other one is them on the back of an Alpha with like the covers on it. So, the test stand image shows you the engines with no covers on them. It's kind of this nice, peel away kind of illustration.
Mm-hmm.
But these 4 engines, like, there are 2 main reasons to have more than one engine on your rocket, right? I think the one that most people think of first is reliability. You gain engine out capability. The other reason is that it's cheaper. Smaller engines are cheaper to produce than big ones. Well, in this case, Firefly put 4 of these suckers on their rocket. And they were only doing it to reduce cost. As far as I can tell, they have 0 engine out capability. And part of the reason that they lose engine out capability is because of their TVC. In a further effort to reduce cost, each of the engines only has 1 gimbal axis. Now, with 4 engines, that's not bad. Like, that kind of acts like, most of the control surfaces on an airplane or on, a model rocket or something. Like, you can tilt 2 of them in the X direction, you can tilt 2 of them in the Y direction, and between those 2, you get 3 degrees of freedom: pitch, yaw, and roll. However, it means that even if you have enough thrust to make it to orbit, if you lose an engine, you also lose attitude authority.
So because the way that these engines like gimbal is that they can only move along one axis, and 2 move in the same axis, like 2 that are like opposing each other, I guess you could say, diagonal from each other. And then you have the other 2, that move in the other axis. But if you lose one of those, then that doesn't really quite work out, does it?
Yeah. You lose half of your control authority in one axis. Like, that can be pretty big depending on, how much you can gimbal your engine. So we saw some, like, in hindsight, there were issues. It seems like one of the engines failed pretty early on in the mission. So the mission overview indicated that they were planning on reaching Mach 1 at T plus 67 seconds. However, during the launch, callouts from Mission Control indicated they reached Mach 1 at 2 minutes, 20 seconds. And Uncle Willie in the chat, not UNC Willie, we sorted this out. Uncle Willie says that with an engine out, you could lose variable throttle control for steering. Yeah. I don't know if they're actually doing that, like throttling down one side of the rocket versus the other, but yeah, that's totally part of it. So anyway, yeah, they got up to supersonic speeds slower than anticipated. So that kind of tells you that they were chooching along a little slowly. And I know that's not what chooch means. I don't care. So and Scott Manley did what he called old-fashioned pixel counting. And he doesn't have full timestamps in his spreadsheet that he posted. It just says video time, and that ranges between 20 and 31. So I kind of suspect that this is actually like 20 seconds into the video. And he's in particular using Jack Bayer's footage for NASA spaceflight. 20 seconds into the video is when the vehicle has actually like cleared the pad. At first, I thought it might be 1 minute and 20 seconds. Oh, actually, I see the screen caps that he grabbed. Yeah, they are like 20 seconds into the flight. But yeah, anyway, so at around 25 seconds into the NASA spaceflight video, the vehicle goes negative in acceleration for however Scott's calculating acceleration. And an engine out that early would seem to be required for such a low or such a long time to get up to Mach 1. However, that raises a question. Why did it take them multiple minutes, like 2 minutes and 30 seconds before the vehicle lost control? And yeah, they hit Mach 1 and then 10 seconds later started spinning out of control. So I think it comes down to the difference in control authority that's required for flying that freaking fast.
Yeah, I mean, like flying supersonic, that's, a separate regime, and I don't understand all of the dynamics there, but it is quite different. And so that's when things, shift in a big way. So that actually makes sense. And I hadn't thought about it.
And even if the vehicle would have been stable, had it been able to get into supersonic, there's a chance that it wouldn't, that the destabilization came from breaking the sound barrier as well. Okay, so Mike in the chat says it looked like it started spinning right when they made the supersonic call. Transonic controls are wonky, aren't they? And I kind of wonder if that's not super true, because like transonic aerodynamic controls are wonky, but I don't know if thrust vector control necessarily has the same issues. I feel like it would be more related to the forces on the vehicle going wonky. So yeah, Uncle Willie points out that the lack of acceleration was noticeable to viewers on the ground. I saw a couple of people saying it looked like it, slowed its acceleration, but I don't know if that's like super visible to the naked eye. And like to give an example, like there was debris falling and there were people saying, oh, I think it's still going, because they can't, just by eye, it's hard to tell that it's actually falling, and it kind of just looks like it's arcing over and heading up to orbit. So maybe that's something that people were able to accurately deduce. Maybe it's just confirmation bias. Kind of tough to say.
Yeah, it would be hard to tell. I mean, I don't think I could ever tell. It's so high up and far away. Like maybe some people can see that.
It's tough when you don't have much of a reference frame, because I mean, it's just up there in a blank sky at some distance from you. That's a big reason why I think a lot of UFO sightings.
Yes.
This thing was the size of a football field hovering. Well, are you sure?
And 90% of UFO sightings are the moon. The other 10% are Venus.
Yeah.
Venus does look great now.
Actually, so speaking of its climb to orbit, or its failed climb to orbit, it was flying pretty much like due west, right? And this was an interesting fact that I couldn't understand it at first, because I had heard about, they had said that there had been some debris that had fallen like north of Vandenberg. And I was like, well, the thing, like, the thing flies south, but then I found out that it didn't. And that's because they had a much wider flight corridor, I guess, or whatever the term is,
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting that they were basically flying retrograde. So if they had got to orbit, they would have been flying in a retrograde orbit, which is kind of neat.
I agree.
Yeah, don't see that too often.
And I think it's pretty fair to assume that if nothing had gone wrong and they made it to orbit, they would have had enough fuel, because I mean, they were running at like 10% of their maximum payload capacity. So yeah, how cool would that have been to have a bunch of satellites orbiting retrograde from this test flight? Maybe it's a good time to talk about the payloads. So the payload package was called DREAM, a dedicated research and educational accelerator mission. It included a number of CubeSats, one of which had a plasma thruster tech demo on board, which is really fun. My favorite, well, let me save my favorite for last. There were also non-technical payloads, photos, memorabilia, that kind of thing. But my favorite is a drag sail for deorbiting the upper stage. Like it's really cool that, it's like a demo mission. I think it was built by a university, but they're like, yeah, we got this drag sail. What could we deorbit with it? And Firefly's like, well, hey, we've got an upper stage. Let's just slap it on the second stage, and you can deorbit our upper stage for us. I think that's really fantastic. Oh, geez. Mike in the chat says their PR department really should have thought about the possibility of blowing up a bunch of students' dreams.
So there's this thing with Firefly that, like the company's called Firefly. The engines on the vehicle are called Reavers, which is a reference to the Firefly TV show. And then that made me think, I wonder if they put a Firefly box set up there because those are famous, just because, they're always floating around.
Famous and no longer in production. Like, that means we have one fewer.
Yeah.
So their press release indicated that they had no injuries. They said that they progressed to supersonic speed, so We know that they were above Mach 1 for a hot second. And the press release also said it was too early to draw conclusions as to the root cause, which is true. I just wish that they could have confirmed that they had an engine out. If you look at the plume in some of the videos, like it's pretty clear that it's off kilter.
So I'm bad at spotting these things, like I keep saying. But looking at it, I do see that if not the plume, then at least one side of the vehicle right there on the bottom looks a little bit darker. Like you can see that there's just something it's not as full looking as, prior to the event. So that seems like a pretty good indication to me that they lost an engine too.
So I'm imagining the folks in Mission Control seeing the engine out and just being like, well, we're not going to space today. During the Astra launch, we saw the wonderful googly eyes on the back of a pair of monitors. What if they had googly eyes and it would have saved them, but instead they put them in the memorabilia and they sent the googly eyes. They were trying to send the googly eyes up to space when they should have kept them in Mission Control to promise a good flight.
See, I'm not familiar with. Is that like a tradition or something? Like having googly eyes? What is
that?
What
well, it is for Astra.
Okay.
Yeah, at least for the last couple of flights, there have been googly eyes. Speaking of photos, there's a fun slow-mo video from Scott Manley in the show notes, of course. And you can see the FTS explosion well enough to see the two different initiators. I'm assuming it's upper stage and lower stage. And the lower stage, if that's a correct assumption, the lower stage explosion is a lot slower than the upper stage, which is really cool because, the lower stage had, was more empty. There was less fuel and oxidizer in it. And if it wasn't absolutely less than the fuel and oxidizer in the upper stage at that point, at very least the fuel and oxidizer are farther apart, right? Because you've got the ullage space in the tanks. So that's kind of fun.
Yeah, that was really cool to see. It was a pretty good view of what it looks like to actually terminate a flight like that because it was probably the coolest looking flight termination that I've seen. Like it looked more like something out of a movie, how like the whole thing blows up. It didn't just like vanish in a big ball of fire, but you could see the explosion happening because the rocket was at just the right angle to see that because, at that point it was kind of like spinning around a little bit. And it was facing the right direction to get a good view of that. Yeah. And so the flight termination, right? Is this pretty similar, I guess, to Astra in that, they knew that they had the engine out pretty early on, but they kept going because one, they wanted to make sure that they just had some distance between them and the base, but also that they wanted to collect as much data as possible. I think that that's the logic. Although the flight termination was initiated by Space Force, that was another thing.
Yeah, that's what I interpreted as well.
Is that like a Vandenberg thing, or is that something for all rockets and I just didn't know about it? Like if you're launching from a base, like if you launch from Kennedy Space Center, would they do the same thing? Is that the responsibility of Space Force?
Yeah, I don't know. I have a vague memory of different companies making different arrangements. I think what might have happened is they kind of said, okay, we want to give you this responsibility so that, we know that it's safeguarded, that we're not going to, fail to recognize something on our own. We're going to let you specialize in that. Mike in the chat says, he thinks it's pretty standard, as well. But yeah, I think that's generally the way it works. I'm sure that Firefly had, the ability to fire the FTS as well. But at this point, Vandenberg is providing the range equipment. So it makes sense that it literally would have had to go through their equipment, even if Firefly initiated it. So it's pretty easy for them to send that signal on their own. All right, and before we move on, I wanted to read this little thing from Mark Kuzik. Before the launch, he said he was most worried about the timing of the launch clamps because they've got 4 of them and they all have to release at the same time. And he said, I can accept if we ultimately find another problem that we could only have found in flight, but I just can't accept a ground system causing us to lose a mission. Mm-hmm. And I identify with that emotion. Like, flight is crazy. There's nothing you can do to fully test except for flying it. But like these launch clamps, we have them on the ground. We can touch them. They're within reach. If something goes wrong, it's going wrong on our doorstep. And that would really suck. And I think that really kind of humanizes things. Yeah, Mike in the chat says echoes of Electron 1 there.
But I assume that if something had gone wrong with the launch clamps, they could have shut down the engines, right? They could have done a safe abort.
Well, they did have an abort on this day before they launched, right?
Right,
they had,
right.
And they didn't specify what it was. At least I don't think we know.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
But they did have an abort earlier. Well, new video from hot off the press. Firefly released video that has resolution and is zoomed in at a level that nothing else we've seen so far has been. Even some good 4K stuff. And you can see, I mean, it was pretty clear already from what we'd seen that, you see a sputtering and then there's asymmetric thrust. Yep. Here you can just straight up see there's just no rocket fire coming out of one of the 4 engines.
Right, yeah. And so that's kind of what I was, okay, yeah. So this is a very good view. And this is what I was talking about, how, once, like, I couldn't see the asymmetric plume, let's say, like the actual exhaust, but I could see that one side of the rocket looked darker. And yeah, that's what it looked like to me.
Apparently we just got the scoop because that video has already been deleted, evidently.
Oh, really?
Oh.
Yep. So, yeah, we are investigative journalists today.
Well, someone is, and we're just riding their coattails.
Thank you, Sam. That's wild. I mean, look at that view, though. That's
mm-hmm.
Forget about it.
I'm sure that somebody has a mirror, but that sucks that they pulled it down.
And like I said, I mean, that is just so obvious. But that Kayvon Chambers YouTube video that you posted,
mm-hmm.
where he has, where they have it broken down by segments like countdown, false abort, then the launch, then the engine failure, then the rocket flies upside down, and then termination. But if you just play it at like 1/4 speed, you just absolutely see, the engine sputter, and then suddenly, there's now asymmetric engine fire or rocket fire coming out of the one side and not the other. It's kind of like we knew there were gravitational waves before we actually detected gravitational waves. We knew there was an engine out before we saw the engine out.
Yeah, but notice that the engine out is really low in the atmosphere. It's not within 30 seconds of the explosion or of the control loss.
Oh, yeah, more like T plus 10 seconds or so, yeah.
Yeah, it's like T plus 10 to T plus 20.
Well, so we know that there was an engine out, so I guess the question now is what caused it? And we'll talk about that hopefully next week.
Hopefully next week, yeah.
So do we have any other maiden flights like next week? I hope not.
I don't think so. So let's do 3 short and sweets this week. What's the first one, Dennis?
Well, first up, new cracks discovered in ISS. Small cracks have been discovered on the International Space Station's Zarya model, according to Energia's chief engineer, Vladimir Solyevov. This report follows on 2019's discovery of air leaking due to a crack in the Zvezda module, which cosmonauts were able to locate and finish patching earlier this year. While seemingly fixed, Russia reported another drop in the pressure of that module last month. Solovyov also stated that the fissures' presence in Zarya suggests that they will spread over time, although he didn't say whether any air has leaked due to the cracks.
That is scary news.
That's really upsetting for me.
That's another thing that maybe I'd like to have more information on that to talk about, because that seems like a big deal.
Are we really going to see the end of the station coming? Like in the next year or two, not like closer to the end of the decade or whatever?
All right, next up, Rocket Lab increases satellite component production. So in an effort to meet the demands of the growing satellite industry, Rocket Lab has increased reaction wheel production at its New Zealand facility. The reaction wheels, formerly produced by a Canadian company that was acquired by Rocket Lab last year, were being produced at a maximum rate of 150 per year. Rocket Lab hopes to manufacture around 2,000 per year in an effort to meet demands from its customers, as yet unnamed. This increased production will also allow Rocket Lab to accelerate the manufacturing of its own Photon rocket, avoiding bottlenecks caused by component shortages.
And finally, Perseverance sample collection update. So the first week of August, Perseverance attempted to collect its first core sample from a rock nicknamed Rubion. But after the procedure to transfer the sample into the adaptive caching assembly, it was discovered that no core was obtained. Views of the drill site and vehicle diagnostics came up empty, literally. The team has concluded now that the sample was not dropped or jammed somewhere inside the processing pathway, but instead had turned to dust and is now part of the cuttings pile and the dust at the bottom of the hole. The rock was simply not strong enough to yield a core. This week, a new sample from a rock named Rochette was obtained, and thanks to the additional step of taking photos of the coring bit, the Perseverance team has confirmed at least a partially successful drilling operation. Further images will determine if the sample hole has been cleared, and then mass and volume measurements will confirm whether or not a successful transfer occurred into a sample tube.
So, moving on to this week in spaceflight history, we have winners. We have Tristan Lowe, Ryan Riegner, Ben Hallard, and the Greek. The clue, which knowing now what the event is, I have to say this is like a really good clue. So good job, Dennis. I like it. The clue is the end of the beginning and the beginning of the salvaging. And I guess I'll let you take it from there. But yeah, that's pretty clever. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I was lucky that it kind of just jumped out at me pretty quick. But yeah, so this event was the 8th of September, 2004. Also the minor miracle that I got the date range and the year correct.
Not a minor miracle, because I've decided that I'm sick and tired of us making dumb mistakes. And remember, I went and checked it and read numbers aloud so that the chat could help make sure that we got it right.
Yeah. That was good. That was good verification. I appreciate that, David and Ben and the chat. And that's also part of today's clue. I wish this mission did verification the way that we did. But the event is the sample return and crash of the Genesis capsule. Genesis, as you might be aware, is a term that means origin or beginning, and so it being the crash of this capsule, that's how it's the end of the beginning, the first half of the clue. But I'll talk about the salvaging later, though. And so, just some broad context. This was the 5th Discovery mission following Stardust, which was another sample return one, right? Infamously had this really cool looking aerogel. But even though Stardust was launched first, it didn't return its sample to Earth until after Genesis did. And so Genesis was really the first capsule, the first sample return mission that went beyond, the Earth-Moon system, essentially, into kind of deeper space. JPL was the managing director. Caltech had the principal investigator. Los Alamos National Laboratory built a lot of the instruments, and Lockheed Martin was the industrial partner responsible for, constructing the spacecraft bus itself. And this thing, I always kind of poke fun of myself at how bad I am at describing spacecraft, but I think I could do a decent job with this one. And so it's essentially a table. It's a spin-stabilized table that's got, 2 solar arrays, hydrazine propulsion. So there's these 2 little round tanks for its propulsion. While on the table you have, different, power units and, some science instruments, star trackers, things that, you typically have on a spacecraft. The real, centerpiece is the Sample Return Capsule, or SRC. And so I'm going to use that acronym a lot just because talking about that Sample Return Capsule is important. And so that's kind of, to give you a visual of what the spacecraft looks like, at least, until it opens and starts doing its sample collection, which is really cool. The reason it was called Genesis is because it's kind of looking into the origins of the solar system, right? With the, the sun formed along, the same time as the planets. And so this was really to kind of characterize just what the solar wind was made of, in much, much better detail than anything else had ever done, because it was going to just directly sample it, just directly collect the ions coming from the sun. And so it was launched in August of 2001 on a Delta II 7326-9.5. So once again, you got a little telephone number after the Delta rocket, but those first 4 digits all correspond to the 3, the 7 means it's a 7000 series. The 3 means it's got 3 boosters. The 2 just denotes the second step engine in AJ10, and the 6 indicates the third step engine, which is a Star 37 FM motor. And then that dash 9.5, I kind of had forgotten that they would have dashes at the end of Delta rockets sometimes, but that's just the 9.5 foot diameter fairing, or 2.9 meters. And so this, it launched in August 2001. There seemed to be a surprising amount of very precise timings that are very kind of human based. So you'll see what I mean. After precisely 1 hour in its parking orbit, it did its third stage burn to take it to the Earth-Sun L1 Lagrange point. took some time to get there, and it got into its halo or Lissajous orbit on November 16th. And, reaching L1, I mean, it was there. And if you zoom out on the scale of the solar system, it was very close to there. But to give you a sense of just the diameter of it as it orbits around that kind of gravitational well, was 800,000 kilometers in a 6-month period. And so for context, right, the Earth-Moon distance is ballpark 400,000 kilometers. So it's basically kind of 2 lunar orbital radii in terms of its orbit around this the L2 point. And so pretty big, but again, that's when you are zoomed in on it. If you look at the whole scale of the solar system, that's it's a tiny little 6-month orbit around that the L1. There's just so much to talk about with this mission, so I'm going to do my best to not get too into the weeds, because the collection devices are really, really interesting, and how they decided to do this was really, really cool. And so let me upload a couple images into the chat for context, because I think here's the spacecraft itself. There's the table with the sample collector on top. And then here is kind of schematically what's going on with the sample collection. Okay, so you have the SRC, the sample return capsule, sitting on top in the center of the spacecraft. And then it can open up the essentially the kind of drogue chute side of it. The heat shell is the side touching the rest of the spacecraft bus, so that can't open. So the top of the capsule pops off, the SRC. And that's going to be, though, like everything that's coming back to Earth. So that's going to include, avionics, and parachutes and electronics, in addition to the actual, collection sample that you want to have hermetically sealed. And so after that opens up, that lid opens the one direction. Opening the other direction, 180 degrees opposite it, is the actual sampler itself, the sampling canister's lid. And on the underside of that lid, after it opens, exposed to space, is, a collection device, which is essentially a tray. And I'll talk a little bit more about the trays after I describe the rest of how it opens up, okay? So you basically got, it's like, you open a lid in one direction, you open another lid in the other direction, and that lid happens to have a sample collector on its underside. And then you have a stack of 4 trays, and one of them slides off to the side, or you can choose when you want to do this. The tray on top is always going to be kind of exposed once you open it up, right? And that's true for the tray that's on the underside of the lid. And so those were called the bulk detectors, and they were just going to be constantly collecting any solar particles once it was time to do that. And then what was neat was the remaining trays underneath this stack of 4 trays could slide out when you want them to do collections. And so they would wait. This was a 3-year mission. They would wait until, it wasn't spending all 3 years at L1, but it spent most of its time there. When the solar wind was entering different regimes, maybe it was a faster wind or slower wind, or had, different kind of things going on. It was more active, less active. When it would enter these different regimes, they would specifically roll out some of these lower trays so they'd be able to collect the solar wind when it was in that mode. And so you had sampling, but also sampling that depended on how the sun was behaving at that time, which I just think is a really neat, clever way to do this.
Yeah, that is clever.
And you do that just by sliding it out from underneath this, stack of 4 trays, right? It looks like, if you stack 4 pancakes on top of each other. Also, when they revealed that, they had built deeper into the bottom of the actual sampling canister of what was called the concentrator. And so this one had an applied voltage, and kind of in the same overall sense as a mass spectrometer works. How that voltage, that's going to affect different particles depending on their masses and charges. And so it was selected to pick mostly carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen ions and accelerate them and actually focus them to a point in the back. And so you'd have a better signal to noise for those, which, you want to get. And so that's kind of it. There were the science instruments. Listen to me when I yapped about stereo, however many months ago that was, if you want to learn about those. It's the same thing. Anytime we do one of these solar missions, you park these, different kind of experiments on there that, count electrons and things like that. Anyway, so that's kind of how this, spacecraft is essentially set up. And, the first array opened on November 30th, which, basically a couple weeks after it got to L1. Another one of the collectors that was specifically for, like I said, when the sun was in different regimes, an example of that, what if there's a coronal mass ejection, right? That's when, right, there's a huge burst of particles coming from the sun. So we see the light And we see that that's happening. And so we have time to then go and tell the Genesis spacecraft, right? Which, remember, L1, that's the one in between the sun and the Earth. So we're able to basically see the light come from the sun. We know that a CME or coronal mass ejection is happening. And so we're like, okay, swing out one of those bad boys and those lower trays and go and see what happens. Like, do you happen to have, a lot of different isotopes or ions that come off during a CME? And so that one they kind of revealed on day 193. Long story short is that, they basically did their collection. And then in April 1st of 2004, they stowed their trays, they packed things up. And again, exactly 3 weeks later, the spacecraft fired its 4 thrusters and headed out to L2, where it would shed a little bit of orbital energy, right? That's going to be, the Lagrange point on the far side of the Earth and the sun. Shed off some energy and swung back to get towards the Earth. And now we're in the sample return mode. So it did this collection that was great. And I should actually say what the collectors are. That might be useful, right? I call them trays. So this isn't anything like the aerogel that we had for, Stardust and, for later missions like Hayabusa and OSIRIS-REx, where, they would basically be blasting the regolith to go and basically travel deeper into the apparatus and then just kind of get trapped in there. These were a set of 73 centimeter diameter. The trays were 73 centimeters in diameter, so decent size, about the size of like a bass drum, I'd say, in surface area. And they consisted of 55 hexagonal wafers each, and these wafers were kind of like almost a hodgepodge of different high purity materials. And so they wanted to basically sample, because different materials were going to be better at collecting things, because all it was essentially the ions come slamming in there and just get embedded into these, 0.5 millimeter thick wafers. And so this included things like diamond, aluminum, silicon, germanium, sapphire, molybdenum, and then combinations of things like, it'd be like, I don't know, sapphire coated gold or vice versa or something like that, And so that's kind of, how they approach this.
Were those materials like well characterized beforehand, and they knew that this would be good at picking up this and this would be good at picking up that?
Yes, and it was actually, I can read from a document that we'll have in the show notes. The process of choosing the materials was complex, as the criteria used in the selection were influenced by a variety of factors, some of which are not necessarily intuitive. And so, yeah, they basically did a lot of work into kind of figuring out, the trade-offs of one material versus another, and then also how many of these wafers would you want of the different types.
Any of those selection justifications stand out to you that you want to mention?
I did not look into them that much. There was just a lot.
That's kind of what I figured. I mean, when it's complex and unintuitive, it's sometimes not the first thing you're going to read.
Yeah, I was kind of giving a cursory glance if there was anything that jumped out about what was interesting about it. And honestly, it seemed that the real name of the game was, again, they're going to have different kind of penetration lengths and, diffusive losses during collection and things like that, as well as how they interact with the solar light. Are they going to heat up more? Are they going to radiate less? And so, but the real name of the game was that they had to be ultra pure. That was it for more than anything. And that's because that's how you basically could tell what came from the sun versus, what you had actually built and sent up there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that was probably the most, the thing that stuck out the most about the actual collectors.
So I'm also wondering why the L1 point, although it does seem, completely logical, but like were other types of orbits considered, or was this just, the obvious choice? Because I would suspect that you could put it in some other kind of a, heliocentric orbit, but then it wouldn't be as close to Earth. And I guess that's just for the sake of convenience instead of, just like having it go on its own little way and then come back sometime later, because it does have to maintain that orbit, right? So that is a little bit more difficult, I suppose. I don't know, probably not really, as far as like station keeping goes.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know enough about the history to know whether they, in like the development phase, because presumably this, if it's anything like a space mission, there was, many decades of, concept studies before you actually had hardware and then actually launched it. But my guess is that just a Lagrange point or a heliocentric orbit was just kind of obvious for the reason that, you want to be away from any other kind of planetary body and just have kind of pure solar wind. You just bathe in that solar wind and collect what you can there. Right? That's why they didn't open it until they got there. Lagrange points being stable probably make things a lot more convenient, easier with communicating with the spacecraft. If you look at the solar panels, you see all these little knobs sticking off it. There's a lot of low gain antennas on there. Not all of them are, but at least a number of them are. That would probably be another thing and especially L1, you're kind of sitting, in the same spot relative to the Earth. But that's true for the other Lagrange points. L5, I think we could obviously rule that out. Why would you want to go to the far side of the sun needlessly?
Well, that would be L3, actually.
Or sorry, right. Sorry, that's L3. Thank you.
But 1 and 2, yeah. So at the L1 point, it would have to maintain that halo orbit, which, I mean, again, is probably not a big deal, really. And it is much more convenient. There's faster communication. They can use those, they can use the low gain antennas. This is way better than having it like orbit the sun and then having to come back around, like from, the far side of the sun and I think maybe just like you said, if there was like a coronal mass ejection, and I don't know what the difference is here, but maybe they wouldn't be able to tell it to open up those, collectors in time. I don't know actually how fast the solar particles travel compared to the speed of light actually. But anyway.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting L1 is a lot closer to the Earth than any other of the Lagrange points.
Yeah.
So you're going to have better bandwidth with communication, and you're not going to take as long to get there. That might have been the ultimate factor.
Yeah.
Why go in a trailing orbit that's going to be, possibly 10 times further away from the Earth, or a leading orbit for that reason. But that's a good insight though. And L1 is also obvious relative to L2 for the fact that you're intercepting the solar wind before it washes past the Earth as well. You know what I mean? And so if you just want to get as pristine a sample as you can.
I have a comment. I'm looking at the fault decision tree in the mishap report. Under drogue system failure, pyro failed, mortar booster charge failed to fire. One of the reasons is booster charge is a dud.
Oh,
I like it. Even the tree says is a dud.
Yeah, that's funny. Because in that report too, I thought it was funny that when they're discussing where some of the things are on the spacecraft, one of the instruments is kind of blocked the way that the diagram is made, and so they say that the Genesis ion monitor is catty corner of GEM.
Nice.
On the plus X SV deck.
Yeah.
As a New Jerseyan, I say diagonal. But yeah. I like catty corner. Okay, so that was the mission, going and collecting the samples and returning them to Earth. And so here's where, the second half of the clue comes in. And this is when the SRC, the sample return capsule, actually comes back to the surface of the Earth. And so about 5.5 hours before reentry, the spacecraft actually spins up even faster, presumably to stabilize the SRC. And then it's separated and, comes on into the Earth, passing through the atmosphere while the spacecraft hits the brakes and goes into a parking orbit. Just in case the capsule fails to separate. And so now you at least have your capsule with you in Earth orbit, and you can try to diagnose from there. But it did separate successfully, which was good. And, it experienced up to 27 Gs on re-entry, and things were going nominally. The profile was good. All was looking sharp until they got to 33 kilometers altitude, or 108,000 feet, when the drogue did not deploy. And you really need that drogue to deploy to slow you down, and also to pull out the main parachute, which was a parafoil. And so it just kept cruising through the atmosphere like a bullet. It lost control and started tumbling, and eventually struck the ground in the same region it was supposed to land, at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. But it hit the dirt at about 311 kilometers per hour, or 193 miles per hour. And so, it's a pretty hardy little capsule, but it's not supposed to do that. And so, as you can imagine, the container was shattered. And they basically, the recovery helicopters go out there, they, scoop it up and they take it to the clean room that they had set up for it, and basically disassembled it, and were able to tag 15,000 fragments and actually get some good science out of it. So this was the salvaging part of the clue. It was the end of the beginning, right? The end of the Genesis spacecraft, or rather the capsule return, and then the beginning of the salvaging. So this was the beginning of trying to get what you could out of that. And the long story short is that it was still successful. They still were able to do a lot of good science from it, because here you had basically cream of the crop, creme de la creme, measurements of the composition, both in terms of, how many different ions, how much iron versus carbon versus, beryllium is getting blown out of the sun, as well as the different isotopes, which can tell you interesting things. And it was actually, I think, those isotopic studies that were the more important ones, I think, in the longer term for understanding things. As you can imagine, though, why didn't that drogue deploy? And so a mishap investigation board was assembled, and they found that this was, it was pretty frustrating. It was definitely an error. There was they call it the design flaw, but the long story short is that a gravity switch device, and I don't know if we've talked about gravity switch devices on the show before. They're also called G-switch sensors. A G-switch sensor basically is supposed to tell when as the SRC is passing through the atmosphere, it's experiencing deceleration. And by the time it hits about 3 Gs of deceleration, it's supposed to basically, trigger some things that happen. And the way it does it is it's a little tube. So it's tiny. You basically put it on a little a relay card. And it's about the diameter of the carbon in your pencil, if you still have a classic pencil. And the way it works is this little nub, this little, tiny thing, has essentially a spring mass or plunger on the one side of it. And then basically when it decelerates, it feels a force and it compresses the spring so that the other end, where the mass is not, has a contact. And so when it feels that deceleration, the spring compresses, it touches the contact and it closes the circuit. And then you can arm things. And then once you leave 3 Gs, it breaks the circuit because now the spring relaxes back to its equilibrium position where it's no longer touching that contact on the far side. And so it's a pretty, they have applications, I'm sure, in all sorts of industry, but, it basically, it's an accelerometer because it's detecting acceleration, but in particular, it's an on-off switch, depending on what kind of acceleration you experience. Now, that's not going to work, though, if you put it in backwards. So that instead of the spring compressing, it's trying to go even further into the same wall that it's on. And as a result, you're never going to get a connection. So it's never going to trigger the rest of the avionics that want to basically deploy the drogue and have everything and do the other things, right? And that's why it just kind of came in there cleanly and slammed into there.
Okay, but big brain time. If you came in through the atmosphere upside down, that would be a really good orientation for the gravity switch.
Well, it would.
Yeah.
So it's not that this thing was messed up. It's that it wasn't messed up enough.
They needed to put the heat shield on backwards as well.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I gotta go put this joint out now.
That's a funny idea. Yeah. No. And so that was the issue. They put it in incorrectly. Why? How did this happen? Well, so it turns out that they the relay cards that these these G-switch sensors were designed to be in an inverted orientation compared to how they were planned for Stardust, which also had these, right? I mean, that's another sample return, And so for whatever reason, they just were like, okay, well, Genesis, we're going to have them going in this direction instead of Stardust's. But during the checking out of the spacecraft and some of the verification processes, they were comparing them directly to Stardust drawings. And so they were seeing them in the orientation similar to Stardust, but they were supposed to be inverted, but they're like, well, no, I mean, this is just based off of Stardust heritage, and so clearly they're in the right direction, and so no problem. And that's just by examining drawings and everything. And then the performance tests that were done were actually done incorrectly. So you figure, okay, you're looking at the you're seeing it, and you don't catch it when you see it, but at least, when you actually do a performance test, it should trigger A-OK. But I guess the tests were done inverted as well.
Oh gosh.
And it was due to the inexperience of the project integrity engineer, who was an electrical engineer looking at mechanical engineering drawings and incorrectly interpreting them. And so the tests were designed incorrectly.
Oh, wow.
So this thing, ultimately, the switches were inverted in the first place. The design review process didn't catch it. The verification process didn't catch it. And the red team review process, like the Team B kind of thing, right? Didn't catch it either. And so this was it was quite incredible how it managed to make it through that many layers. And so, as you can imagine, the mishap identification or investigation board had quite a few suggestions. But ultimately, some of the top items, I don't want to go into all details, but JPL needed to be have more systems engineers be involved with the actual construction that Lockheed Martin was doing when they were actually building, the SRC, and that the review process was inadequate, to say the least. That there was overconfidence in Heritage hardware. Right, this thing has flown before. We've flown these plenty of times, so we don't have to kind of look at them too carefully. But evidently, inverting them would be an issue.
Yeah.
They failed to test as you fly, and they even called out the whole, this is the early 2000s, and so this is the faster, better, cheaper philosophy era, which, to some extent we still do. Yeah, and so they kind of, that was not a major contributing factor. It really was the review processes and some issues there. And so, long story short, that's how that one slammed into the earth. But we still, it's kind of the best type of failure, though, where it you still, are able to get something good out of it. The spacecraft basically then went and flew back out to L1. They still had thrusters, or they still had fuel. It was hydrazine monoprop, and they basically maintained contact. I don't know if they used, obviously they weren't collecting samples, but they had those science instruments that I ignored this whole this week SF, and basically until the middle of December later that year, so another couple months. The spacecraft was there until they stopped maintaining contact with it, and so presumably that's where it's chilling to this day. That is your spaceflight history. That is this week in spaceflight history.
Yeah, I guess just add that to the list of missions that have gone wrong because of components being installed upside down.
I know, right?
It's disturbingly long of a list.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Dennis. That's that was a good one. All right.
Thank you.
So next week is the 14th through the 20th of September. David, do you have a clue for us?
Yes. So next week will be in 2013, and the clue is Virginia is for lovers of space.
I like this one.
All right, 2013. If you know what that clue is in reference to, shoot us a tweet with the hashtag ThisWeekSF, and good luck, everybody.
Good luck. So let's move on to upcoming spaceflight events. We got some launches. We got launches and a spacewalk. So the first event is a launch, and that's on December 9th, and that is the launch of a Soyuz 2.1V with Razbieg 1. And Razbieg means takeoff, and this is a military satellite, a military optical reconnaissance satellite. And apparently it used to be called Zvezda, but I guess they wanted to change that to not confuse it with the module.
Good call.
Probably a good idea. Now, the launch window is from 1900 UTC to 2100 UTC, so a fairly large launch window. And again, that's on September 9th, and that's launching from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in Russia.
All right, then next up we have a Russian spacewalk. This is Spacewalk 50 for Russia. They're going to continue outfitting Nauka, as you might expect. That's going to be Novitsky and Dubrov. And the spacewalk is scheduled to start at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on September the 9th. That's Thursday. It's going to be around a 5-hour spacewalk. Coverage is going to begin 8:30 a.m. On Thursday, and this is all Eastern Time. And then let me jump forward in time. We're going to get ourselves out of sync here a little bit. But on Sunday, the 12th, is going to be a U.S. spacewalk. This is Spacewalk 77. This is for more iROSA rollouts. Coverage begins at 7 a.m. Eastern Time on Sunday. And then the spacewalk is scheduled to actually start at 8:30 a.m. Eastern, and it's going to be about a 6.5 hour spacewalk. And Dennis, why is this not a U.S. spacewalk?
Yeah, so this was the one that was postponed when Mark Vande Hei had the pinched nerve in his neck. And so since he's still got that going on, Thomas Pesquet is taking his spot. And so this is going to be both a JAXA astronaut, Aki Hoshide, and a ESA astronaut. And so this will be the first time ever that a non-NASA, or that there'll be a U.S. EVA without a NASA astronaut.
It's really the first time. That's pretty cool. I didn't know that. International cooperation. Yay!
Yay.
On spacewalks. Yeah.
And then finally, more of a heads up, but there's a no earlier than launch set up for, it's a little outside of our range. It's September 15th, but it's a big deal. It's Inspiration 4. And so keep an eye out for that. It's got the cupola bubble where the docking port would typically be. If you haven't seen those pictures, check them out. It's really impressive. And that's just going to be an amazing, all sort of, all non-NASA astronauts, on board. You know what I mean? Like, it's going to be a fully private, fully commercial. I don't know how they call it, but like, yeah.
Yeah, it's the first.
Something else.
It's the first fully, I guess it's the first like fully private mission. So there's no government astronauts, I guess. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, not only that, but as far as I understand, nobody on board is employed by SpaceX.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So it's literally tourist only, which is pretty cool. And so the reason that we really want you to keep an eye out is because they're supposed to pick a launch window 3 days before the 15th. So I guess that'd be Sunday or Monday, depending on how they're defining things. So that could be coming up soon. All right. So those are your upcoming spaceflight events.
With that, then, let's deal with the show. And we would like to thank Ronald Jenkins and Tim Dodd for our music.
Thank you so much to our $5 and up Patreon supporters for joining our recording sessions and helping us make correction burns on the fly, including in today's show where we had Uncle Willie, Delta V, Sam, Mike, and Chris, aka Sty Garfield, in the chat today. Thanks for joining us.
If you want to support the show as well, please leave us a review wherever you listen, or visit theorbitalmechanics.com/support for our Patreon campaign, affiliate links, and other resources.
And for more information on this episode, such as show notes and other links, visit our website at theorbitalmechanics.com and be sure to check out our store for mission patches, t-shirts, and hoodies.
The mission patch, the first generation mission patch, is about to sell out. I think I have 2 of them left. I believe I held back the Apollo mission number patches because they've got a serial number on the back. So I believe 8 through 15 I have held back. I just don't know where they are. Those may become available. I was going to save them until the end, but right now there are only 2 left in my drawer. We have Generation 2 in production. It's on the way.
You can also join our Discord for free during social distancing. Check our Twitter or Reddit for links. We're Orbital Podcast on both, and you can talk directly to us by emailing info@theorbitalmechanics.com.
All right, so that's it. We will see you next time on Orbit. Until then, later.
Goodbye, everybody.
See you.